Hello again. This video review is on the scientific method, or more properly, the process of science. See, biology is a science, chemistry is a science, physics is a science, astronomy, geology, these are all sciences. But what is science? Well, quite simply, is often thought of as a way of knowing. Well, a way of knowing what? A way of knowing how volcanic eruptions occur, a way of knowing how aspirin works, a way of knowing what the moon is made of, and so on and so forth. In other words, it's the study of nature on nature's own terms. Now, oftentimes books discuss the scientific methodology, because science is a methodology. See, science is not just the facts and theories and so forth that are in the science books, but it's also the process by which we learn this stuff in the first place. So again, science is a way of knowing. So the most common way to discuss this methodology is by the scientific method. And the steps of the scientific method are roughly paraphrased right here. Now, even though there are plenty of examples of the application of the scientific method, sometimes hypothetical examples work just as well as any. So I'm going to be using the hypothetical example of an 18th century nursery rhyme. Now, the first part of the scientific method is typically an observation that lends itself to a question. Again, if science is about answers, helps to ask a question first. So here is the observation that lends itself to a question. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? Well, that's an observation that lends itself to a question. The next thing is to propose a hypothesis. Now, most people think of a hypothesis as an educated guess, which is true, but what are we guessing? We're guessing the answer to the question at hand. So a hypothesis is a tentative answer to the question at hand. Back to the nursery rhyme. Here's the proposed answer. With silver bells and cockle shells and pretty maids all in a row. Well, that is a tentative answer to the question. It is a hypothesis. Well, we can debate on how educated a guess that may be, but it is a tentative answer. And as such, it can lend itself to a prediction. So the next step is make predictions. A prediction, of course, is an if-then statement. If my hypothesis is true, then I expect such and such to happen. In this particular example, if bells and shells and maids made Mary's garden grow, then I should be able to have that make my garden grow, or more specifically, increased number of tomatoes, increased biomass, or dry weight, or crop yield, something measurable. Now, we can't stop there. We have to put the hypothesis to the test. Now, of course, controlled experimentation is one way to do it. In this case, an experiment could be set up. I could set up a series of gardens. I could have a garden as a control group with no bells and shells and maids, and I can have experimental gardens with bells and shells and maids, and other experimental gardens with various combinations of bells and shells and maids, and I can grow the plants, and I can measure the dry weight or biomass or any measurable criteria, thereby testing the hypothesis. But regardless of how we test a hypothesis, what we're doing is we're gathering and analyzing data. Hypotheses are tested with data. See, a scientific hypothesis has to be testable. It has to be falsifiable. Now, falsifiable doesn't mean that the hypothesis is false, but it does mean that if the hypothesis is false, we should be able to demonstrate it by putting it to the test. So let's say I did this experiment, and let's say I found no statistically significant differences at all with any of my gardens. Well, I would come up with a conclusion. See, there's two basic scenarios. Either the data support the hypothesis or it doesn't. In that particular scenario, if there are no differences between my control and experimental groups, then I can conclude that my hypothesis is refuted. Bells and shells and maids did not make Mary's garden grow. Something else made Mary's garden grow. Back to square one. But let's say it did. Let's say that my data overwhelmingly supported the hypothesis that bells and shells and maids have an effect, a positive effect on plant growth. Well, the next thing to do is to share the findings with the scientific community. A lot of books leave this step out, but the truth is science is a team sport. The way that science progresses is by making this available to the rest of the scientific community to build upon or refute or whatever. Now let's just follow this scenario. And a common way to report findings, of course, is to publish them in an appropriate scientific journal. Most scientific journals are connected to an appropriate society, professional scientific society that publishes that particular type of research. Let's say there is such a society, and we'll call it the Society of Applied Nursery Rhymes. And let's say the Society of Applied Nursery Rhymes has an annual meeting where experts in the field come in and they get to present papers and so on and so forth. And let's say that this society publishes a journal called the Quarterly Journal of the Society of Applied Nursery Rhymes. So what I would do is I would write up a manuscript and I would send it to the managing editor of the Journal of Applied Nursery Rhymes. This editor would then locate other experts in the field, send my manuscript out to them, and they'll look at my research, they'll look at my manuscript, they'll pick it apart, they'll look for weaknesses. That's called peer review. Peer review is very important in science. So they're going to look for things that are wrong with my manuscript. Did I misspell a word? Did I not cite enough literature? Did I not do enough background literature research? Did I use the wrong statistical methods for the type of data I was using? Did my conclusion not match what my results were? They look at all of that. And then they mark it up, they send it back to the editor sends it back to me, and I've got to fix it. And then I fix it, I send it back, and then it passes peer review, and then it gets published in the Journal of Applied Nursery Rhymes, where it's available for the scientific community forever. Other scientists can follow up on my work. Other scientists can refute my work or something like that. That's how science has progressed. So scientific knowledge is cumulative. Now, another thing to discuss, of course, is the difference between a scientific hypothesis and a scientific theory. A hypothesis, of course, is specific. It is narrow in scope and it is subject to be tested. But a scientific theory is a major explanatory model that has been built on a large amount of accumulated scientific support. Hypothesis after hypothesis after hypothesis, all pointing in the same general direction. So this is just a brief overview of the process of science.